This episode of the Fiction Writers Podcast is brought to you by the Novel Notebook. With each character and each setting, hundreds of details must be compiled and organized. Far too many for a writer, like you, to keep them cataloged in your brain. The Novel Notebook provides the answer. Visit www.fictionwriterspodcast.com/novel and quickly discover how to organize your materials and take your novel to the next level. Welcome to the Fiction Writers Podcast with Lana Mcara, where you will discover tips, tricks, and ideas for fiction that is #unputdownable. Here you'll find new energy, new perspectives, new resources, and new ideas that will spark your creativity into a blaze of brilliance. It's easier than you think. Be sure you visit our website at www.fictionwriterspodcast.com. While you're there, subscribe to us via your favorite network. Now, get out your notebook, tune in, and let's get started.
Have you ever thought about writing science fiction? That's what we're going to talk about today. My name is Lana Mcara. Welcome to the Fiction Writers Podcast. Tips, tricks, and ideas for fiction that is #unputdownable. Today, I am delighted to welcome to our podcast, Richard Anderson. Richard is a retired bioanalyst. He was a clinical laboratory director with 40 years experience in hospital and reference laboratories as administrative or technical director. He's a scientist and humanist with a strong interest in the future of our species. Richard is the author of 2 books. First is a nonfiction book called The Evolution of Life, Big Bang to Space Colonies. And then the second one is a fictional extension of that book called Outbound, Islands in the Void. And he's currently writing a second book in that Outbound series. Richard attended San Jose State University with a BA in microbiology and a minor in biochemistry. He has a master's degree in microbiology and passed board examinations for the California bioanalyst license. He's from the greater San Francisco Bay Area, and he and his wife have raised 3 children and currently celebrate 4 grandchildren. Following retirement, he traveled widely with his wife and continues to travel and write. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you. Beautiful introduction.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to talk to you because you're a scientist, and that's really what drew me to you specifically, because you took your science background and turned it into sci-fi. So why did you start writing?
Why? Was that the question? Why?
Yes, why? Why now?
Oh, yeah. I suppose because I didn't have time while I was working. I did do some writing in the mid-90s because I had a job that basically was very undemanding. And so I would write on the job after I'd done what I needed to do. So, and then when I retired, I always had a dream of writing. It was in the back of my mind. I wanted to express some thoughts. But when I retired, the temptation to travel was too great because my wife was working, throughout our life, and we did not really get much time off to do what we wanted. So we traveled, and we traveled widely and until COVID hit. As a matter of fact, we came back to the United States in March of 2020, just as the outbreak was starting. And from there, the lockdown occurred. And so the lockdown gave me an opportunity what was I going to do? I sit at my computer, and you can't surf all day. So I started coalescing some thoughts on my nonfiction book. And that's how it started. So it took me about 2 years. I did a lot of research to firm up some knowledge that may have been way out of date. So that was a necessary part.
Okay, so you started first with your nonfiction book, and then what shifted you over to fiction?
Well, I think it's the same thing that started me on my nonfiction. I was concerned about several things, and one being that science seemed to be losing status or stature, let's say stature, with the public. In other words, there's a lot of mythology, a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of things coming out of social media that absolutely were not true, but they weren't vetted. You know, the old-fashioned newspaper had reporters that they actually had to vet their story. They actually had to verify the facts in the story, and they could give it a political slant, but they had to have base it on reality. Mm-hmm. And so that was bothersome. And there were a number of ideas I had picked up or thoughts or questions throughout the years, and I decided to start writing. And my concern was, number one, the environment. Number two was the future of humanity. And they're inextricably linked. Yeah. And when I started writing, at first it was strictly, Big Bang starts with physics. So it was basic science from the beginning. And then toward the end of the book, we get into sociology and formation of civilizations and with a nucleus of various religions to bring greater societies together and also to separate societies. And so that led to, okay, where are we going in the future? What are our possibilities? And space came to mind because I'm interested in settling space and in space travel and those sorts of things. So the end of my nonfiction book kind of ended up not exactly fiction, because I was talking about possibilities in the future. Mm-hmm. And how would you form, how would we live in space? How would we live on the moon or Mars or in space colonies? And so then published that book, and I'm twiddling my thumbs again. So I started thinking about the space environment and all the challenges that would present, and one of them being society itself, for humans. How do we treat one another when we have when we have an assassin in a crowd, or when we have an arson in a forest? We can't have those kinds of dysfunctional people. If we have settlements in space, the settlement wouldn't survive even one incident. So that became a point of discussion or concern, and I started developing the story. For the fiction book, it's about 250 years in the future. And then, of course, you go back to the science, like, well, this is what I want to do. How would that be possible? Or how would the science settle the problem? And one of the issues in writing science fiction, or it's called hard science fiction, is, or a new category is climate fiction, because we're talking a lot about climate, and we're talking about setting up ecosystems in space. So that reflects on how they work on Earth. And then we're talking about social systems. How do we set up society in space, in small islands? A lot of questions to answer. So I built the story around Earth in 250 years in the future, and we're in a recovery mode post climate disaster. Let's put it that way. So I didn't want to have the book be a downer. I wanted to be optimistic. So, okay, we had the disaster. All these horrible things happened. We're in the aftermath of that, trying to recover, and we still have bad things happening, but we're finding solutions. So I try to make it hopeful. I guess in a nutshell, that's what got me into it.
Okay. So you took your future casting from the end of the nonfiction book and took that over into your story. So the story setting itself and the characters, where did you get your ideas for that specifically?
Yeah, and that's the big difference between, fiction and nonfiction. So science fiction is a lot like historical fiction, except that the author writing historical fiction has a template to build on, to work with. Science fiction, you have to invent everything. So I started in with a vision, with an idea, with a setting, and I had no idea where it went, except I knew where to place it. It was on an early space colony. And so my first chapter concerns, it describes this setting and what happens. And then you finish that chapter, and it's rough, but you start looking at, okay, what's the next chapter? So you look for a jumping off place from the first chapter, and you develop the next chapter. And sometimes, and then once you get a few chapters going, you're kind of going back and forth between different parts of the story. I have a lot of characters in that story, and I made a list of a list of characters for the book because it gets confusing.
Yes.
And when you develop a new scene or a new part of the story in a different location, you're going to need people. So you have to develop a new character, and then that can create confusion to the reader in my mind. My wife read the book and she goes, "Oh my God, I can't keep track of all the characters."
Yeah.
So I had developed that so you could quickly refer back, like, who the heck was that person that they talked about 6 chapters ago? So there are different parts of the story that actually could stand alone if it were done as a series or something, because there are events happening on Earth. There's events happening in space, in different parts of space.
Mm-hmm.
There's a venue at Sirius in the asteroid belt where there's a facility that develops raw materials and sends toward Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Part of Earth's recovery is to get resources from space, because Earth is busy trying to rebuild environments. So pit mining operations, industrial farming, a lot of those things have been curtailed or scaled back to reestablish natural habitats, to try and reestablish ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where space plays into, the recovery, Earth's recovery.
Mm-hmm.
All fantasy, but maybe it will happen.
You never know. People are influenced quite a bit by fiction.
Oh, I agree. Oh, well, take for example the cell phone. I mean, the idea, it came from, I think, Star Trek. The flip phone that Captain Kirk had. Beam me up, Scotty. And and the next thing you know, some engineer goes, "Hey, we could really do that."
Yeah, exactly. I just want to mention that on my website, lanamcara.com, there is a resource called the Novel Notebook, which helps you keep track of all your characters and your settings and different things in the plot and so forth. So it's a
I would. Yeah, I would really recommend that because, and another thing is a timeline, and another thing is an outline. And so people think and write differently, and I only know how I approach it. And I tried writing an outline, and I wrote an outline, and then I started writing, and oh, darn it, I wasn't following the outline. The story went in a different direction. So then I would change the outline. And then I'd go back to writing again, and the story went off in a different direction, and I changed. And then pretty soon, why am I writing an outline? And so the story is it develops organically, I think. As you develop characters and as you develop scenes and so forth, they lead to different events, because what would this character do next, or what would this event lead to? And it's not something that you can plot all at once. It kind of evolves over time. And then, of course, you go back and rewrite. And then with this novel, the space novel, I had a lot of trouble with the timeline. I had to go back over and over and to make adjustments, because I'm dealing with travel between, say, Earth orbit and Ceres and the asteroid belt, and how long the travel time and also the communication time. So you cannot speak directly with somebody. You would have to do something on the order of texting or that kind of transmission, because there's maybe a half-hour delay between, so you're not going to say something to your other person and wait a half hour for them to say, yes, that's true, or whatever. And the same goes for Mars. So then you're dealing with two things: conversation. You can't have conversation at a distance, so it has to be via text. And then what do you have the character do? Sends the text. He's waiting a half hour or an hour to get a response, and you can't just have him sitting there as a chair or doing nothing during that time. So then you have to fill in with what other activities they're doing during the interim, and then you interrupt whatever you're doing, and when the new message comes in or the response comes in. Mm-hmm. So those were particular problems with when you're dealing with that kind of a sci-fi story where you're dealing with great distances and travel times too. So it may take 2 years to get out to the asteroid belt. It may take 6, 7, 8 months to get to Mars, depending on relative positions. So then you go back and you say, well, this couldn't have happened because that person is in transit to somewhere, so then you have to fix it. And that took a lot of work. After the book was written, it made sense, except the times didn't match up.
Right. The details, and believe me, readers will catch those details.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then another thing, when you're trying to convey complex information and you don't want to get into a lot of prose that is going to and I did do that a little bit. I had to get into prose, but I tried to break it up, because you start to lose the reader. They'll go to sleep on you.
Yeah.
So then you try to put that in dialogue context. So dialogue brings so the prose and the descriptions bring your story to life, and the dialogue brings your characters, gives them life, and brings them to life. So when I was writing dialogue, always I would get the idea, okay, this is what I want communicated between the characters, and I'd write this dialogue. And I think that's kind of necessary as a first step, because you want to make sure you get the meaning down that you want. And then you go back and look at it and you go, this is highly stilted. It's not the way people speak at all. So then, keeping the same meaning and keeping the same intent, you rework the dialogue to make it more real. And one of my tricks was to throw in where it was apparently a non sequitur, because that's how people talk. They'll make a comment as nothing to do with what the conversation was, except and you want it to appear as a non sequitur, but it really does fit in and has meaning, and it fits in with what you're talking about, but the reader doesn't get it immediately. So my analogy is, if you are listening to Beethoven, if you know how he styled his concerts, he would take this music down to such a low level that the whole audience would almost go to sleep. And then he would come back with bum, 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 you come back with it. And everybody is shocked awake. Well, our minds are built to recognize a change. So when you've been in one mode for a long time, you start to ignore it. Your mind shuts it out. Okay, that's nothing. I don't need to pay attention to that. But all of a sudden, a wild boar jumps out of the bush. You're gonna you're gonna be very alert. So that's what you're trying to do in writing, is to throw something in there unexpected occasionally. Just, I think that's my opinion. Just to as a wake up call, like, hey, you're reading this thing, and I did that in nonfiction too. If I'm getting into a description that's technical, and I would have to throw something in there to the person will go, wait, what did he say? They go back and they think about it. So I have an example. I was in my nonfiction book, I was talking about how pigs are used in France to find truffles, in the root systems of trees.
Mhm.
So they go by smell. They have a very sensitive smell. Well, the truffle, when it's ripe, and this is, we could get into evolution, but anyway, the truffle, when it's ripe, it gives off an odor that's much like a boar saliva. And so these sows are used to hunt the truffles, and they smell they smell that boar saliva smell, and they start digging. And of course, they're pulled away to keep them from eating the truffles, and they give them some other less quality mushrooms or whatever is a reborn. So I'm describing this whole thing. And then at the end, I just throw in a sentence that said, but however, nobody knows if the sow is disappointed at not finding a boar when she digs down for the truffle. And I think someone, when they first read that, they're going to do a double take, kind of like, what? So that's kind of what I'm talking about, as far as a little bit of a shock to get people back. There's another example when I was talking about a mutation that created mammals. Actually, was a fragment of a virus that became part of the DNA of humans, and it protects the fetus from being rejected by the mother as the fetus develops over a long period of time. Normally, the mother would start to develop antibodies. So if you look at a marsupial, they give birth to little eraser-sized babies, like kangaroos or whatever, to prevent the fetus from being rejected because they don't have that strand of viral DNA incorporated in their own. So it was a virus that caused the evolution of mammals, and there's all kinds of scientific terminology that would bore the heck out of everybody, and maybe in the book too. So at the end of that, I said, so if that mutation, if that virus strand, that viral strand, had not been incorporated in human DNA, humans, Homo sapiens, would not be here. Perhaps another species would replace us, say Homo marsupialis. And that species, the female would have an easier time giving birth, and she would be less likely to misplace her cell phone. So does that set the description in your mind, though, of what I was talking about? You might have been going to sleep.
Yeah, sure.
So you can do that in nonfiction as well as fiction. So right now in the book that I'm writing, it's a process where you're going through dialogue and you have a concept that you want to convey, and you get the basics down, and then you just can't seem to fix it to work right. And you sit there at the computer and you think about it, and pretty soon you're kind of at an impasse. So it happens to everybody. It happens to me. I'll go out and do some yard work. I'll take a walk. I'll go have a beer, something. And I get back to it that day. And then, but that problem sits in my subconscious. And sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and go, oh, crap. And then I have an idea of how to handle the problem, how to solve it. And that is your subconscious mind, which is very uncomfortable living with a problem. Your subconscious mind wants to resolve, anything that's sitting there unresolved or uncomfortable. And then you were depressed before because you can't solve this problem. You can't come up with a good idea. And then all of a sudden, bam, it hits you and you're just elated. You come down, you can't start helps to start writing as fast as you can. So I think all writers have experienced something, to that effect. Well, we've all had blocks.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I wrote a novel. It was a romantic suspense novel where this woman was in a trunk of a car. The bad guy threw her in the trunk of the car, didn't want anybody to see that she was with him. And she's in there trying to figure out how to get out. And so there I am trying to figure out how she's going to get out.
Yeah. All of a sudden this lever appears on the inside of the trunk. Yeah, that's, yeah. You paint yourself into a corner, but actually that's a challenge. And that's how Andrew Wise wrote The Martian. Is he would say, okay, here's the problem. It seems unsolvable. Okay, but he's got to overcome it. What are the possible solutions? And then he would work on that till he figured something out. And then the next issue comes up. And if you want a real life analogy, you go back and watch the movie Apollo 13.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a stepwise solution to problems. Okay, we don't know the end solution to this problem. We don't know how we're ultimately going to solve it. But here's what's happening right now. This is what we need to solve. And once we solve that, then we're going to look at the next part of the problem. Because if we don't solve this one right here, the rest of the problem doesn't matter. It's all gone.
Yes.
So there are a lot of analogies in real life that, of course, that's what you were mimicking in fiction, and you're trying to simulate it, not actually reproduce it, but you're trying to do a good simulation of your imagination that looks like real life.
Yes, that's a really good point. And the character development happens incrementally over time, where you're giving them different tasks and then they learn and they develop and so forth, just like real life. I mean, that's what we do, isn't it? Our relationships do the same thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So in the novel time, there's another issue with writing. So we live in our real time. And so then it's just, you see this in a sitcom or a movie you're going to see for 2 hours, and it covers whatever time time is compressed.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing happens in your novel, that you can cover many years in a story and compress it into a day's read. Well, that's for the reader. So the reader reads at one pace, and the writer writes at a totally different pace, much slower.
Yes.
So it's difficult to have a good time concept while you're writing. You think all this time has gone by because it's taking a long time to write that paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, when you go back and read it, wait a minute, I got to fill a lot of time here because that only took 5 minutes, to read. And so time is an issue you have to look at. You have to step back from the story and look at that as one element.
Mm-hmm. Right, and then parse it out slowly. So when do you actually leave science and make some stuff up?
Well, it's kind of integrated in hard science fiction. It's kind of like historical fiction because you have the characters that you've made up, um, and you place them in a historical situation where actual events have occurred. And so, what was your question about the what?
How much do you stick with true science and when
Oh, yeah.
things up?
So in historical fiction, you want to stick with true fiction, with the true history. I mean, that you're overlaying your story on.
Mhm.
In hard science fiction, you want to stick to a template of scientific reality. So if you're traveling between Mars and Earth, you've got to allow the time. If you're trying to create, which I do in this story because I think it's important, has been proven by studies in science on the space station and so forth. We need to live in one gravity. It's called standard gravity.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're going to settle Mars, which is about 40% of Earth gravity, if we're going to settle Mars, that's going to have a detrimental effect on future generations. So we bring in some hard science and we say, how would we address that to keep people living spending most of their time in standard gravity? So I create some mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So that's where the reality is. It's not being done, but it's real as far as the science is concerned.
I see. Yeah.
So NASA right now they're planning a moon trip. That is going to be like the first step for a Mars trip. So far as I've been able to find out, they haven't designed a rotating spaceship, which is what you would have to do to create. It's called centripetal force to create a one gravity. There's some technical problems or issues with that, but it's possible. And the problem is you would have astronauts sitting in a capsule for 6, 7, 8 months at zero gravity, and then all of a sudden they go through a re-entry into down to the Martian surface, and they're only in 40% gravity, but their muscles have largely atrophied. Now they've worked with exercise machines and things like that, which does help, but it doesn't prevent bone loss, particularly in your leg bones and pelvic girdle, and even your spinal column. Those weight-bearing bones of your body are used to 1G, and if you are at 0G or you're less than that, they'll start to decalcify. And I don't think people would want that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go to Mars, but I don't want to. I don't want to become. Yeah, that's right. So those are. So you create those realities within the story. So a person who is a scientist reading hard science fiction, they look for, is the science real?
Mm.
And if there's something that's a stretch, they'll pan that. It kind of turns them off the story. Mm-hmm. And I know when I was a lot younger, I was really into like Star Trek and Star Wars, and they're good stories. They're space cowboy movies and absolutely no science at all.
Right.
Star Trek is tried a couple of times. Well, now if I go back to watch something I enjoyed in the past, I get bored with it because I go, oh, this is just stupid, Mm-hmm. So if you're writing hard science fiction, the intent is to challenge scientists and get some input from them and get their interest. Mm-hmm. And fantasy is a whole different category.
Yeah, fantasy is different from science fiction. Science fiction is Earth, and fantasy is anything you want.
Yeah, I mean, and I've read some really good fantasy stories. I have a collection of, science fiction and fantasy. Ray Bradbury wrote some really interesting books about Mars that had absolutely nothing to do with the science.
Yeah.
But they were fun. They were fun reads, and it gave him a palette to develop a story that he really couldn't do in an Earth setting.
Yeah. Wow, this has been great. I can't believe our time is already gone. That's amazing. It just flashed by like a minute.
I know, isn't that incredible?
How do we get your books? Where do we find you?
I'm on Amazon Kindle, and I have a website, richardandersonauthor.com. And, or if you just put Richard Anderson author and do a search, and it'll come up, and you can click on that. You'll get to my website. It tells about my books, and I have a blog attached, and so forth. Okay. So, that's the way.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. This has been a great discussion. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. I have too.
And thank you for being with us today. See you next time.
Thank you for tuning into the Fiction Writers Podcast with Lana Mcara, where we share tips, tricks, and ideas for fiction that is #unputdownable. Remember to visit our website at www.fictionwriterspodcast.com and enjoy even more great episodes like this one. Again, while you're here, subscribe to us via your favorite network. We look forward to seeing you next time on the Fiction Writers Podcast.